This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 344. Chicago Plan. Why it never went anywhere.
You know what? This something-for-nothing economics isn't conservative, it's socialism.
And now inflation is hitting double digits.
The assumption is that an independent central bank will raise interest rates in order to attract money into the country to finance the budget deficit.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
This week, how well protected should the banking sector be? This week, we look at the Chicago plan that followed the Great Depression, a plan that aimed to stop any future runs on banks. Well, that didn't work. The plan really was to stop banks lending out money that they didn't have, to stop them creating money, in other words. Well, bits of that plan did turn into legislation, much needed. Some of it didn't see the light of day. So what can we take out from the Chicago plan all those years ago? And was it a good idea? That's this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast. All right, so this one came from the Debunking Economics website from Brent Valentine. Firstly, thanks for this podcast. I had a basic understanding of economics, well, from the neoclassical perspective anyway, and this has really opened my mind to another way of thinking. Please, could you discuss the Chicago plan and how this relates to modern monetary theory? Thanks, Ben. So Ben, I said, sorry, I'm not sure. I think I might have said Brent. Sorry, Ben. So the Chicago plan came after the Great Depression, of course. It was Chicago economists all getting together, and they basically wanted to stop banks, well, creating money. There seems to be a bit of a misunderstanding as to what it actually wanted. They only wanted banks lending out money that they had 100% deposits for, because that would, they reckon, abolish risk. It doesn't, though, does it? I mean, first of all, we have to get an understanding of when money goes into a bank, where does it actually sit? But if the thinking was, well, I'm only going to lend out money that somebody's given to me, that doesn't abolish risk, because in the meantime you might have invested that money, which of course banks are not supposed to do.
You've got to go back and do the accounting here, and actually, to give a full answer here, I'll actually need to go back and do that, which I haven't properly done using Minsky. But the fundamental idea, first of all, banks create money by creating loans. Okay? Yeah. I've see so much confusion on this. So another person commenting on my Twitter feed a couple of days ago, saying that banks don't actually create money. I'm sorry, they do. Okay. Now, the money, when you look at what money is fundamentally two things. It's cash, and only the government can produce cash, whatever country you're in. Print the paper yourself, you'll get a knock on the door at some point. So the cash is one thing the governments and only governments can create. But the other major form of cash these days is bank deposits. Yeah. Now, who can put an entry in a bank deposit which is not offset by a deduction from another deposit? And the answer is that the banks can, because they can put, if they put a sum into your deposit account, then they've got the right, if you agreed to them doing it, to put exactly the same sum into their assets, which is a loan to you. So they create money by bumping up their assets on one side through loans and bumping up the liabilities on the other side through deposits.
So the Chicago plan was based on the wrong premise then. It was based on the idea that the loans are given out from deposits that are put in.
Which they don't do. So there's parts of the Chicago plan involved both Irving Fisher and Milton Friedman, amongst other supporters at various times. Milton Friedman obviously misunderstood the financial sector. Irving Fisher understood it properly after the Great Depression. He was a fool beforehand, but he got it right afterwards. So his understanding would have been different on that front. But what you're trying to do is stop the banks being able to create loans indefinitely by expanding both the asset and liability side of their balance sheet. That's what the real Chicago plan would have to do.
So this idea, it's a misinterpretation then of the Chicago plan to say that what they were trying to, because you read the popular press about it, even from the time, it was to try and get rid of this idea of fractional reserve banking,
which of course, as I've said, is the myth.
Doesn't exist.
So that's the problem. You're trying to abolish the myth.
Yes, but that is based on this idea that I put 10,000 or I put £100,000 into the bank. They can now give a loan out to $1 million.
Yeah, which is not what happens. So what you'd have to do, and again, I've said it would not take a long time to sit down and do this, but it's time I don't have right now. But what you would have instead, and this is the proposal from Positive Money and other groups like it, that rather than banks having an unlimited capacity to create, well, a capacity limited by their equity. That's bank equity is what limits their capacity to create new loans and their willingness to lever their equity compared to the liabilities they have. So that's the main control on what they currently do. What you'd instead say is, okay, the government is now going to create fiat money. Okay, and that would be the only form of money creation. Then would be the government running a deficit. So in its own right, I've got to say that's probably my main reason why I would favour a plan like Positive Money or the Chicago plan, because we'd finally have a system we'd have a policy which admitted what the system actually was, rather than having myths about it.
Okay, so that being the other way that money's created, so the government creates that fiat money, and so the idea would be that banks would not be able to create money.
But then the banks would then have a fund at the an asset at the central bank, which the government itself would control how large that fund was. So the bank would then lend out, and each time they lent a dollar to a person from the private sector, then the fund they had would go down by $1. Okay, now the idea is therefore the only way they could make a profit is by arbitrage. So if they lent money to people, they'd have to be charging more for the people who borrowed that money than they paid for the money themselves. And that would be quite feasible and in a Chicago plan system, because you could actually say, well, private loans are a public service. Okay? You want banks to be providing loans for various purposes. You'd want a private sector person making a decision about whether a particular firm deserves working capital or not, rather than a bureaucrat. So that sort of argument.
Right.
But the only way they'd make it, so you could actually give them the money at zero cost, and then say you have to make your profit now comes from the margin, charge. Not from the volume.
Yeah.
At the moment, they make a profit both from the volume and from the margin.
Right. Okay. So in other words, it's the interest they charge on that loan.
Yeah.
It's how they make money. But the bureaucrats are deciding how much money there is.
So
the bureaucrats are the ones deciding how much money there is there.
Yeah, and that's the point people often revolt about. But the thing is, they're doing it anyway and doing it badly by believing they should run a surplus. Okay, which means they create less money than they should, and so the whole
less money than there was. In fact, you're shrinking the money supply by creating that surplus.
Yeah. So that is the reason, like a positive reason to go for a Chicago plan. But in terms of the accounting of it, the idea would be that the banks would then have this reserve that they had replenished by the government, and they could lend out of that fund, but there would be a fixed amount that they could create by loans, or put into circulation by loans.
So let me give the reading from the Chicago plan then, which I think is supporting what you're saying. So the Federal Reserve banks should liquidate the assets of all member banks, pay off liabilities, and dissolve all existing banks, and new institutions should be created which accepted only demand deposits subject to a 100% reserve requirement in lawful money and or deposits with the reserve banks.
See, they're demand deposits. And this is the point that the mainstream gets wrong, because a demand deposit means if you put $100 into the bank, you can come back tomorrow and demand that $100 back, and the bank simply has to give you that money.
Yeah.
Now, that means that money, your money, has not been lent out to somebody else.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're going to control demand deposits like that, then you can't be lending them out. And that's the contradiction.
Right.
What you're instead doing in the real world is you don't lend the demand deposits out, you add to the demand deposits when you create a loan. That's what's happening right now. So, your savings are irrelevant to what the bank actually lends out. It's the bank's willingness to create a loan which determines how much is in deposit accounts. If you put $100 in the bank, you go to the bank tomorrow, you can take $100 back out again. It hasn't been lent. Okay, the loan that they did to somebody else has added to the bank accounts in circulation, and also added to the assets of the banking sector. So if you're going to stop that, you've got to have a system that means that banks can't inflate their asset side. And at the moment, they can inflate their assets by lending.
Or by investing, can't they?
Well, no, banks face extreme limits on what they can actually do with any of their assets.
Right.
So
that was one thing that came out of the Chicago plan, though. I think the one thing that was enacted, wasn't it? There started to be a limitation on what they could do with the money, which had been given to them by depositors.
Yeah, in the past there was and I don't really. If you go back to the Pecora Commission, that'd be a fascinating read for most people, because the Pecora Commission exposed the extent to which the banks had been involved in all the speculation and bubbles and financial chicanery of the 1920s. And that's what led to all the regulations, which then said banks have got very strict limits on what they can actually do with their money. And really a lot of what you can see in post-World War II history is banks trying to find ways to get away from those constraints. And we've ended up with probably almost as financialised an economy now as we had back in the 1920s. So we've gone in the opposite direction to the Chicago plan, because a huge part of it was restraining banks from bad behaviour. Instead, we've rewarded them for bad behaviour.
So we've separated, of course, now the idea, that the money that you deposit in a bank gets used for risky investments. Banks can engage in risky investments, but they've got to do that not with that money.
Well, they don't do it with at all. I mean, again, I said the way that they lend is by increasing the loans, which are an asset, and increasing the deposits, which is the liability. So if you are going to effectively control them, you have to have a means to stop them creating additional assets for themselves. And one way you could do that is to say, well, if you lend, then another asset has to fall. Like that's what people think happen right now. They think when banks lend, their reserves go down. Okay, but if the reserves go down, if that's the only asset that falls in value, then their liabilities have to fall in value as well. Their liabilities are money. Okay, so if reserves go down, you can't have deposits going down at the same time. Okay, it's just accounting is false. You get Minsky points it out to you straight away. You go to -2 times which is wrong. You go to 0 for your sum for the row. So in that situation, if banks had an asset which was created by the government, which was the limit of what they could lend, and as it went down, okay, you'd have to have that asset falling, another one rising. Okay, and then the loan itself could not turn up on the deposit side of that same bank. Okay, the loan would have to be in another form. Now, the easiest form is cash. Okay, but a negotiable instrument has to be the form that a loan would take in that world.
So the Chicago plan, I mean, it's easier to understand the workings of banks under the Chicago plan then. So because the banks would just loan out, they'd have an account with the Reserve Bank, which would have so much money in it.
Yep.
And that's how much they can lend out.
Yeah, and what you'd have effectively is that they'd be lending cash. Okay, the cash would be created by the government, and they probably buy the cash with their electronic reserves, let's say, and then when they want to lend out, they'd put it in cash form, so the borrower can take it out of the bank and have a loan, which they would then be willing to accept. You have to get the money to be willing to take on a loan. You don't go to the bank and say, I'd like to have a loan for $1 million. Say, right, okay, you owe us $1 million. Where's my cash? Okay.
Yeah. You don't want it in cash. But
you want it in cash. Because if they say, we're going to increase your debt by $1 million and give you nothing, that is not what you go to a bank for.
Yeah.
Okay? So if you're willing to let you if they've got an asset which is $1 million claim on you, somehow in some form you want that $1 million. Now, at the moment, it turns up in your deposit account. But if you made this change to try to implement the Chicago plan in the actual financial system we have, then the asset, which was the bank's lending fund, would have to go down. Their loans would have to go up. And the only way that I can mentally work this out without doing a Minsky model physically to take me through the steps would be if your loan came out in a negotiable instrument, and the most obvious form is cash. So to make the Chicago loan system work while still enabling banks to lend, you'd have to have cash as the form of loans, I think.
So if I go to the bank and say I want to buy a house that's worth £1 million and I want £1 million loan for that, the bank would say, well, okay, we've got £1 million
Or they'd be writing a transfer on your behalf to the person you're buying from.
But they would have to have that £1 million sitting in their bank
somewhere
with the Reserve Bank,
and that would go down. So that account would fall, and therefore they would have less capacity to continue lending.
And the size of that account sitting with the Reserve Bank would have been determined by how much money has been created by the government.
Yeah, for that purpose.
Right.
So, and if you think about it, a huge part of it, and we remember the Great Depression was caused by the banks, was to stop that ever happening again.
Yeah.
And in that particular situation, you get a very unlikely set of bedfellows, Irving Fisher and Milton Friedman. Now, Friedman was and died a neoclassical economist. Fisher began a neoclassical economist, had the near-death experience of the Great Depression, and completely flipped his analysis. But he also came out in favour of something which restricted the capacity for banks to behave badly.
Right. They both thought banks were too big and had too much influence on the economy.
Well, if you look at almost all neoclassical economists, certainly the bloody Austrians, who are really annoying the hell out of me right now with some correspondence I'm copying from them, they are trying to change the system to eliminate the existence of banks as we know them. Okay, their whole idea is banks are committing fraud. So the Austrian
because of the money that they're creating.
Because they create money. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, so they're not committing fraud. They're obeying the rules of accounting.
Yeah.
So if you want to, and that makes the Austrians end up being more revolutionary than most Marxists because they want to change a fundamental aspect of the capitalist system. And I'm not against it by any means, but it's they think they're describing the current system and criticising it. They're actually don't understand the current system, and they're pushing for a radical reform, which is like the Chicago Plan. I wish they just knew what the hell they were doing.
All right. Well, let's look at who might not like this idea, and are they outnumbered by those people who think it perhaps would be a good idea, and how would it change the world? We'll look at that when we come back on the Debunking Economics podcast. It's me, I'm Phil Dobbie, he's Steve Keen. Back in just a second.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Okay, we are looking at the Chicago Plan, this idea that basically banks could only loan out money if they had the money, as opposed to what happens currently, which is where they create the money. So money creation would only be made by governments who could control the amount of money that's in circulation. That's what we're looking at today in answer to an email that's been sent in by Ben. So thanks for that, Ben. So who would be against this idea, apart from banks?
Well, I'm potentially against it, because one thing which worries me about that situation is that the only way that would work is if the banks were actually profitable out of an arbitrage business alone. Okay, and like at the moment, they're far too profitable, they're far too big. A huge part of the profitability comes out of financing asset bubbles, which is why we have booms and crashes, as we've had in the last 20 years. But if you do say that banks can only lend out money which is created by the government and allocated to them to lend, then they have to be much, much more cautious in their lending. And
it's going to cost more to lend.
Yeah, there'd be larger interest rates being charged as well, because you'd have to cover not just the charging interest on your loan, but also charging interest on your loan in case somebody else's loan goes bad. So there's got to be a large, you expect a lot of loans are going to fail.
So it's because we're back to, I can see why the Austrians would like this, because it's all about scarcity of money, isn't it? It's like saying, well, okay, there's going to be less money around. Therefore, you've got to, it gets back to the whole thing about, money is such a precious thing. We've got to be careful what we do with it.
Got to conserve it, blah, blah, blah.
So if it was determined by governments, and we know how governments hate the idea of running a surplus, so governments would be trying hard to control the supply of money as well. Yeah, so money would become very scarce under this.
And you could end up, therefore, with an economy which, granted, I've got my issues about economic growth right now. However, let's go back 200 years. If you'd done this in the early stages of capitalism, and there would have been a shortage of money all the time.
Yeah.
And there's belief that people have about the flexibility, like, money's just a measuring stick. It's never just been a measuring stick. It's been a motive force in capitalism throughout. There's one thing I really like about Richard Vague's work, Richard being one of our supporters on Patreon as well, but a banker, quite a successful banker in his own right. He's done brilliant research with his group, the Debt Economics Group, and they've gone back and looked at actual historical, like, newspapers, reconstructing data series. So if anybody's not following Debt Economics on Twitter, I recommend you do follow and look at their work. But Richard makes the point that a huge part of the industrialisation that occurred during the 19th century and even the 20th was driven by speculation. The railways were all about, land speculation and making, like, particularly in America they were. But that left an enormous legacy of industrial structures for the rest of us. And as unstable as the financial sector system has been, because it's produced this, particularly surplus of money, in one sense, a huge amount of investment occurred, which may have failed in booms and crashes when it first occurred. Almost every financial crisis back in the 19th century was a combination of a housing crisis and a railroad crisis. But the legacy that it gave us of this industrial structure is incredibly valuable now. So would you get the same creativity out of a highly constrained financial system? I'm not sure.
No, because if a bank has the ability to create money, in theory, of course, most of that money that's created by banks goes into houses. And the appeal there is because there's collateral on the other side, isn't there? So, banks are...
But then if you go back to the 19th century, they create money for railroad ventures, and the collateral would be the railroad. All the land along the railroad as well. Yeah. So if the borrower failed to pay, then the bank ended up owning the asset. Which, with the financial sector being the vampire squids, the credit. But in terms of the physical world in which we all live, there's now a railroad. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so that's the creative side of debt in that sense.
And the Chicago plan, someone comes along and says, I want to borrow some money for a house. And the house is worth $1 million, I want to borrow $1 million. The bank goes, well, that's pretty safe for us. We'll dip into that $1 million we've got sitting in our reserve bank account. If someone else comes along and says, I need $1 million because I want to invest in this, they'll say, well, that's a bit more risky. And we've already spent our $1 million. We haven't got some, money doesn't grow on trees, not these days.
Yeah.
So that fluidity that the banking sector has.
That's what I worry about. So, it's... Can you create the fluidity without banks having the capacity to create money? And one thing which obviously I'm supported by crowdfunding these days. I've supported a ridiculous range of crowdfunding ventures myself as well. And partially the argument in favour of banks creating money for investment is that they have to actually go and do the research, and if they're not just financing housing bubbles, then they've got to go and say what's a viable industrial project, what entrepreneurs look like they might actually deliver, et cetera, and they're going to do a better job of that than a bunch of bureaucrats trying to do it in that sense.
For example, investment in alternative technologies, for example.
Yeah. So now one other way to do it would be to give people money and say, okay, you can use this money only for crowdfunding. And then what you get is the intelligence of crowds. Now, sometimes that works out to be incredibly...
There's a bit of self-interest going on here, dear listener. There's a bit of self-interest going on here.
This is certain, but I think that's why I said I throw a large amount of money myself out in other ventures. One I wanted to see was an Australian firm that developed the world's first portable computer. And that never, there was going to be an iPad-type clone, and it never came about, so my money went up in smoke. Other times the money's come back to me in various ways, portable equipment, exercise equipment and stuff like that. But you do want that private sector feel for private initiatives and innovation. And if you got rid of the banks having that capacity, and they've largely got rid of themselves by financing speculation rather than investment, I'd still want to have some wisdom of crowds turning up as opposed to the madness of crowds in how we allocated money and invested.
So the Chicago plan was all started because the idea was that they're trying to stop runs on banks, wasn't it? Fundamentally, it was to say, well, you know, there's going to be money around, because they
with a false idea of what caused the runs.
Yeah. So the IMF in 2012, the IMF wrote a paper about the Chicago plan and said one of the advantages is that having fully reserve-backed bank deposits, I guess they are, aren't they? In effect, that's what we're talking about, would completely eliminate bank runs, thereby increasing financial stability and allowing banks to concentrate on their core lending function without worrying about instabilities originating on the liability side of the bank sheet. But, I mean, which is fair enough. But when there's a run on the bank, I mean, the bank is either doesn't have the money, which means it would be trading insolvent if it doesn't have the money to back out those loans, or it's just in some illiquid form. They can't get their hands on it quickly enough. They're the only they were the only reasons there'd be a run on the bank, isn't it, under the current system?
Well, I mean, one of my favourites actually is Northern Rock. On that front, because as it happens, as well as we know they all collapsed over here, and there was a run on Northern Rock. One of my colleagues, Australian as it happens, but he used to work for an American financial company. He said he went on a regular tour of Europe, which he did as part of his business, and ended up going, I think it was Finland, maybe in Sweden, but he found all these people had bought bonds from Northern Rock. And he said he got back to Boston, hopped off the plane, and asked, what did you decide to do when you were in Europe, boss? He said, short Northern Rock. Because he knew that they were so desperate to get the liabilities to match their asset side, had to be overinflating the assets, a crash was likely to happen.
But how did they get into that situation? That was because they had bought stuff that wasn't worth as much as what they paid for it.
Just a huge speculative bubble. They finance asset price speculation on a grand scale. There's lots of fraud going on as well. They had to cover their asses, and they were getting money in from other people. So the outgoings, they had outgoings that exceeded their incomings, and one way to cover that was to borrow money long and lend short. And he said this has got to end in catastrophe, and it will. So there was fraudulent behaviour by the bank, and down they went. So you'd put a limit on that sort of behaviour, and that's a large part of what people see as being wrong about the 1920s as well. One side effect about the 1920s, which still stuns me when I see it, is that we know it was a huge stock market bubble. Why was it a stock market bubble? Because margin loans, which in that those margin loans from banks enable you to put down 10% of the value of the shares. They put down $100,000, you could buy $1 million worth of shares. Margin debt went from being 1% of GDP in 1920 to 8.5%.
Yeah, crazy stuff.
Crazy stuff. Okay, so that's the sort of stuff the Chicago plan was directed at, not letting that happen anymore. But of course, it also tied up with the fallacies that mainstream economics has about how banks actually operate. So I would like to have something which meant bank lending was for unavoidably large consumption items, working capital for corporations, and genuine investment. That's what I'd like to see. Whether the Chicago plan as put forward would actually get you there, I'm just not sure. And I think it might end up with a stultified financial sector which would enable less innovation than we saw capitalism achieve in the 19th and early 20th centuries.
So the other thing that came out of that Chicago plan, although the one thing that actually happened was the separation, wasn't it, between commercial and investment banks?
Yeah, that's right, and that's a major improvement.
Yeah,
but at the same time, then where does Morgan Stanley come from? Where does Goldman Sachs come from? I don't know the actual histories, but I would not be at all amazed that they were basically manoeuvres by other people in the financial sector to evade the controls placed on banks.
Yeah, so they said, well, okay, we'll run a separate investment bank, but we're still and there's banks where
and they were the ones who were rescued during the 2007 financial crisis.
Yeah,
my favourite element in Hank Paulson's book On the Brink is actually reproduced on the dust jacket, so you don't have to buy the book to read it. Just read the dust jacket. He gets
I love bank books like that.
Huh?
Yeah. There's so many books like that where actually
all the good
stuff.
stuff's on the cover. Okay, but in that particular book, the dust cover explains him getting a call, I think from the chief of Goldman Sachs. I think he was Goldman Sachs. I'm just not sure. He may have been one of the others. But Goldman Sachs chief rings him up, and he's ex-chief of Goldman Sachs himself. He says, "You've got to do something. We're going to go bankrupt." And he said, "Well, how long have you got?" And the answer was, "About 3 hours." So with a plunging value in the assets, and this is why they were separated, because when if your asset portfolio as a bank included shares, and there's a 10% fall in the share market, your assets fall 10%, your liabilities remain constant, equity goes negative, you're bankrupt.
So under that scheme, though, so to separate, so hence the reason to separate out commercial and investment banks. So so today, that is the legislation in most parts of the world. Yeah. So I put my money into my bank account. That money is not going to be used by that bank
to buy shares.
The bank will use its own assets basically to
it can't buy those assets in the first place. It can have reserves or bonds.
Yeah.
Now, there's some limited classes of assets which are allowed as well, but the banks fundamentally have to be backed by either reserves or bonds, whereas the merchant banks, can buy whatever they like, including shares.
Yeah. Okay. And if the bank goes under for any reason, then there's a compensation scheme, which I think also came out of that Chicago plan. There's a compensation scheme as well, which I think
insurance schemes.
Yeah, which came out of the Chicago plan as well. So
but they were also restricted in amount, and that's the other fragility can come from that, because if you have I think the Australian situation limitation of $100,000 per deposit account, pretty trivial for the
£85,000 in the UK.
Rupert Murdoch would not be comfortable with that. So what you therefore get is runs can occur, but it's now the wealthy doing the runs rather than the poor.
Yeah.
And the fun thing about, back to the current structure, what people call fractional reserve banking, when you look at the rules when America didn't have reserve deposit requirements, and it doesn't anymore. I don't think it abolished them in 2017 or something like that. But when they had those rules, and the rule was they had to have 10% of household deposits. So what the reserves were there for was not to limit bank lending, but to mean that if the households had a panic, then the banks had 10% of the outstanding household deposits on hand in case there was a household panic and people would line up on the pavement to get their money out. But there was no rule whatsoever for corporate deposits, and no rule for international. So it was always there just to handle bank runs.
So the Chicago plan, and I think we've convinced ourselves, bad idea in terms of money creation, because of that fluidity that giving banks the opportunity to invest in worthwhile investments to help grow the economy, rather than it being stuck in the hands of a government that probably doesn't want to create too much money because we don't like creating money because it makes us a bit nervous. And we're all civil servants, so what the fuck do we know anyway? So you've got that problem. It doesn't solve the problem, which seems like the real issue, which is not to do with money creation as such. It's the investment banks which are getting involved in all of these dodgy schemes, investing money which they do have to put into schemes like mortgage-backed securities, for example, which are in their very essence dodgy, getting people to put their money into these schemes for something which isn't real money.
Yeah.
Even though it started with the bank's real money and people investing their real money to create bubbles of stuff that really doesn't exist.
Let's actually follow up on this by, like we're discussing the Chicago plan. Let's discuss positive monies plans as well. One show, and I've got to go through. I'm actually on the advisory board to positive money, money because my knowledge of private banking and my Minsky software and so on. But I've got to have a good look at their plan. Let's have a good look at that and because the Chicago plan won't happen. Positive money, maybe.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, we'll do that in future weeks.
Okay.
We'll add it to the list, the ever-expanding list for the Debunking Economics podcast. It's been a good one. Good to talk, Steve. Catch you next week.
Okay.
The Debunking Economics podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.